In the closing words of the last lecture, I was talking about Foucault's deconstruction of the idea of man, also known as humanity. I was talking about the deconstruction of the entity that Foucault calls l'homme in the closing pages of his 1966 book, The Order of Things. Now let me go on now to add to my list of ways I think Foucault is right. Right to identify what he calls the death of man with three cultural developments. But now we're talking about what he calls the death of man, or in other words, the death of l'homme, in other words, the death of this Kantian creature who was at once part of the empirical world and also part of the rational, transcendental world of pure reason. This sort of dual creature, which Foucault calls l'homme, that's what died. It was not that humanity died in every possible sense of the word humanity. What died was what Foucault is talking about. And he identifies it with three things. First, the death of God, as depicted by Friedrich Nietzsche. Secondly, the death of the king, or the death of the monarchy in the French Revolution. And third, the collapse of belief. Now, by collapse of belief, what he means is collapse of belief in the transcendental philosophy, like the philosophy of Kant, which gives humanity a certain sort of super worldly status as part of as a transcendental being. So I think he's right about this. I think it's really true that these three things made it impossible to continue with humanity defined as Kant defined rational entity, and as Foucault calls them. Now, first, I think it's really true that it used to be the case, and in some places it's still the case, that humans are considered human because they're made in the image of God. In other words, there's a divinity, and there's a certain divinity about human beings because there is such a thing as divinity. And I think that Foucault is right to say that in a culture that is atheist or agnostic, where God no longer exists, therefore humanity understood as a divine being in the divine image cannot exist either. Secondly, I think it's true that there really was a tendency, maybe more emotional than rational, to find the meaning of one's life and one's allegiance to one's king. As you live to serve your God, and your king was a theme in French culture and in European culture at one time. But if there's no more monarchy, then it doesn't make any sense to find the meaning of humanity in service to your earthly lord and master, your king. And I think it's also right, I think Foucault is also right to find Kant's transcendental philosophy to be brilliant but not believable. So if the reason you believe in humanity is because you think humanity is a Kantian transcendental category, then the death of humanity has to follow from our inability to believe in that sort of philosophy. Okay, but in the end, what I want to say is that these apparently abstruse philosophical issues revolving around what it is to be a human person are issues about authority. John Dewey was right when John Dewey said that Kant's critique of knowledge posed the central political problem of modernity. Foucault echoes Dewey by saying that when belief in a transcendental realm dissolves, then l'homme, as conceived by Kant, also dissolves. So let's look again at this brilliant but unbelievable idea of a transcendental, non-empirical humanity from a point of view that looks at the functions of authority in functioning cultures. In other words, let's try to bring this discussion down to earth to what happens in cultures and how cultures get organized. Now, assuming my premise that authority is to a large extent what organizes human life, we can reply to Foucault that the death of God, the death of the monarchy, and the death of belief in transcendental philosophies does not have to mean the death of all authority. It does not have to mean the disorganization of human life. Now, let me take an extreme case when we're talking about disorganization of human life. Let's talk about the disorganization of a human personality. Sort of a human personality disorganizes, collapsing into schizophrenia or maybe something worse than schizophrenia. Now, it's true, as Foucault assumes and as the critical realist state, that there's no necessary reason why an individual biological human body has to be inhabited by a single human personality. A body might be inhabited by multiple personalities, as in the case of Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, or there are many people today in some asylums, some outside asylums, who have different personalities in the same body. Or a body might house a weak personality which tends toward disintegration, as in the case of a homeless beggar who's on the street, who has no sustained personal relationship with anybody, and whose brain is continually attacked by drug overdoses and by the onslaughts of the mass media. Nonetheless, now here's my point. I want to connect this idea of authority organizing human life brought down to the level of the integration of a single personality with the notion of authority. In the normal case, where in Western cultures there's one social person inhabiting one physical body, what integrates behavior to make the body's behavior a person's behavior is normally some principle of authority. For example, in Plato, we learn about the alliance of logos with thumos, that is, the alliance of the rational part of the soul, the part of the soul that has words, the logistiki, suke, as Plato calls it, that makes an alliance with pride, with the sense of wanting to defend one's integrity. So pride and reason sort of come together, forming an authority principle that governs and integrates a personality. Or in Freud, we have the ego and the superego, the ich and the subject, or in subsequent theories of ego development or ego strength. We have an integrating of the personality which depends on a sense of authority. So if it were true, as Foucault says, I think maybe he is basically right, that the French Revolution brought both religion and monarchy to an end. Excuse me, I take that back. Religion is not at an end, but at least there are a lot of people who are not religious anymore, but there are a lot of people who are too. But if we're in sort of Foucault's mindset, where he's thinking of the French Revolution as a sort of turning point in intellectual history, where you could no longer conceive the world as organized by either religion or monarchy. That does mean the end of a world where people live to serve their God and their king, because there's no God and there's no king. It would mean the dissolution of the principles of a social order, and would also mean the disintegration of one historically given way of being a person in a body. Talking this way, I don't want to sort of rule out Merleau-Ponty's and other people who have a much more subtle account of the relationship between persons and bodies. I'm talking about Foucault, but I don't want to sort of prejudge other issues. Okay, so on Foucault's view, the invention about 1790 or 1786 by Kant or even a little earlier, around 1800, the invention of man or humanity, this dual being, empirical and transcendental, was in principle the invention of an autonomous moral agent whose self-given law was simultaneously the source of its own dignity and of the basic constitutive rules of society. Remember that Kant, in the Metaphysics of Justice, derives from his idea of the of human being and the freedom and dignity of the human being the basic rules of freedom and property and commercial exchange. Even cites Ulpian, the Roman jurist, as sort of on a parallel with Newton. And Newton developed the sort of basic principles of the physical world, and Ulpian developed the basic principles of the social world. And all of this derives from a certain concept of man, or as some people say, a certain philosophical anthropology. So Kant's transcendental human being solved a social problem. That's what I'm saying. That is to say, it was a key to solving both the general social problem and the specific personal problem of a self-understanding of me trying to make sense of what it is for me to be a human being. So let's assume that Foucault was right to say toward the end of his 1966 book that humanity, as thus reformulated by Kant and others who argued in a similar vein, made psychology possible. As what we think of as psychology had to be about this type of entity that Kant defined. And let's suppose that Foucault was also right when he said that thinking of humanity this way made possible emancipatory social movements. You could have a social movement for human liberation or human emancipation whose goal would be to reform social institutions so that humanity would enjoy in real life the rights and the dignity that it's entitled to in principle, in thought. However, suppose we grant Foucault all that, and suppose we grant Foucault that it all had to come to an end with Nietzsche's death of God and with lack of belief in transcendental philosophies and with the death of the monarchy. Excuse me, I'm saying this all wrong. I got this all mixed up. What I meant to say, let's grant Foucault that if we can't believe in transcendental philosophy anymore, then these social functions that Kantian philosophy performed are no longer performed by anything. But if we grant that, that is not equivalent to assuming that Foucault can tell us there's no other way to conceive humanity. Even if we grant that as a matter of historical fact, the sort of leading thinkers and the leading leaders of the time in 1800 conceived when they talked about the rights of man and they talked about liberty and they established the great liberal social order and they took over the white man's burden of spreading the social order to Asia, Africa, and all the world. Even if Foucault was right, that what they had in mind when they talked about humanity or talked about man was this kind of being that emerges in transcendental philosophy, this does not imply that there can be no humanity without Kant. It does not imply that other cultures at other times and places, for example, in Africa with the concept of Ubuntu, it doesn't imply that there can't be any African concept of humanity or any Oriental concept of humanity, which we would recognize concepts like human, person, human development, humanity, human rights. We can make sense of these in other ways. The fact that this particular way is no longer viable doesn't mean that we can't be humanists anymore. We could even rescue some points similar to Kant's. For example, Kant makes the point that humans should be treated as ends in themselves and not as means only. So to rescue this sort of Kantian idea that humans should be treated as ends in themselves, not as means only, we don't have to believe the arguments Kant made for it. We can say this is a good idea. It would have been a good idea if someone else said it, and it's a good idea for reasons that don't depend on the particular arguments that Kant made in favor of it. So if we agree with Foucault that transcendentalism as Kant conceived it, that is a transcendentalism that says that human dignity in its essence derives from identification with pure reason, which is the same everywhere, eternally. If we don't believe that anymore, that kind of transcendentalism, I do, however, agree with another kind of transcendental argument. And let me tell you the other kind of transcendental argument. I don't agree with Foucault when he says nowadays no transcendental argument whatever is valid, because I want to suggest one that I think is valid. And that's the one that Roy Bhaskar makes. Bascour's transcendentalism says the following. You ask the question, this is sort of a transcendental question, what must be the case for science to have the success that science has in fact had? And Bascour says the condition for the possibility of science is the existence of a real world independent of the ways humans conceive it. So that's a transcendental argument for critical realism. We can't possibly explain how physicists are able to figure out how to go to the moon, and how medical science is able to come up with ways to cure diseases, and how DNA analysis and carbon dating, none of these things, these things just couldn't have happened without a transcendental condition of possibility, which is there really is a world that scientists study, which doesn't depend just on what we happen to think of it, but on what is actually there. Now, I endorse that transcendental argument for naturalist realism, and it's one of the premises for the claim that nature judges culture. It's not true, as Francis Fukuyama says, that there's no appeal from culture. You can't say, well, there's an unsolvable conflict in our contemporary world because culture just is what it is. They believe what they believe, we believe what we believe, and there's no higher appeal. There is a higher appeal. And the higher appeal is that some cultures work and others don't. And some cultures work and others don't because there is a nature, and the nature simply is what it is, and we have to adjust to it. We can't simply change it by changing the way we decide to talk about it. Now, I also want to say that there must be authority. Human institutions can't function without it. And some forms of authority are better than others. I want to advocate what I call non-authoritarian authority. Authoritarian authority is worse than democratic authority. To get on with the business of life, we need concepts of what it is to be human, we need concepts of human rights, and we need concepts of human duties. And some concepts of humanity, some concepts of dignity, some concepts of rights and of duties are better than others. And it's not just arbitrary to say what is better than others. If a culture is so organized in such a way that it destroys its habitat, as ours is, then that culture ought to be changed. We can derive an ought from an is. Now I've been saying to Foucault, okay, Foucault, let's assume that if we assume that Kant was 100% wrong, there's still good reasons for holding humanistic ideals. Now let me backtrack a little. I don't actually think Kant was 100% wrong. The respect for persons Kant called for can be defended, maybe 10%, by modified versions of the reasons Kant gave for respecting persons. But mainly, I'd say roughly 90%, I want to rely on reasons that Emil Durkheim gave. Durkheim says, and others, that moral authority is a physical necessity without which a society cannot function or a culture cannot function. So what ought to be respected in the end is a functioning culture. A functioning culture is the current accommodation of culture to physical reality. It's the rules of the culture that exist here and now. Whatever here may be and wherever here may be and whenever now may be. So it has to be the starting point for improving norms and institutions. We can't start to build a new society just building castles in the air. We have to start to build a new society starting where we are. And if we're going to respect human beings, that means we have to respect culture, because human beings are cultural creatures. So we can't say, I respect you, it's your culture I don't like. we have to have a respect for the animal whose ecological niche is culture needs to be respect for cultural forms. So now this may seem paradoxical, but if you think about it, you'll see that it makes sense. That Kant is unavoidable for a reason Durkheim gave. Now Durkheim points out that we just happen to have a culture which is in a certain way culture denying, or in Durkheim's terms there's such a thing as a collective consciousness which people in a culture share. And we just happen to believe, at least some of us, those of us who live in the modern West, We just happen to live in an individualistic culture. Well, why is individualism the norm? Well, it's because culture says it's the norm. So Margaret Thatcher may be scientifically wrong when she says society doesn't exist, only individuals exist, but as a sort of spokesperson for the dominant ideology, she's right. We just happen to have a culture which says only individuals exist, or at least it tends to say that. So we really have to accept Kantian ethics because of history, because that has been, and you know, I've taught undergraduates in philosophy for 30 years, and you get a conversation going, and in the first 10 minutes somebody comes up with an idea that derives from Kantian philosophy or some similar philosophy. Of course, they never read Kant, they don't know anything about history, but they do know that the individual has rights, right? And that's just part of our culture, whatever its scientific status may be, and therefore it has to be accepted. It has to be accepted because we have to respect cultures as they exist, and if they happen to be cultures which somewhat paradoxically take a non-cultural view and think that it's simply a fact of nature that we are separate individuals with no duties toward each other, that's a culture which has to be accepted as any other culture. So, if Kantian respect for persons is unavoidable, even if it's unavoidable for the practical reasons that Durkheim gave and not for the transcendental reasons that Kant gave, then, are you ready for this? Then the Foucault of 1966 is avoidable. Why is Foucault of 1966 avoidable? Because we can still be humanists even if the philosophical arguments for humanism in Europe in 1800 are no longer convincing. So for Foucault, the death of l'homme, I'm moving on a little bit, make another point. For Foucault, the death of humanity, conceived as l'homme, spells the futility of misguided projects. Now I'm quoting Foucault. The futility of the liberation of l'homme, of human being in plenitude. In other words, liberation projects are futile because what they intend to liberate doesn't exist. There is no such thing as humanity. And so you can't sort of propose a plenitude of human being after the revolution and justify the revolution that way because there's no such thing. For this reason, Foucault must be acquitted of any charge of avoiding Marx. Sometimes you say, well, he doesn't say anything about Marx. Why is he avoiding this major figure? He's not avoiding him at all. He attacks Marx head on. He attacks the very idea of human liberation. He attacks the very idea of emancipation. He attacks Sartre's philosophy of human liberation, not Sartre alone, but Sartre, anybody who thinks in a similar way, as straightforwardly as Ludwig von Mises attacks proposals to socialize ownership of the means of production. So from the non-existence of humanity, the liberation projects lose legitimacy because there's nothing to liberate. Foucault briefly summarized his anti-Sartrean views in an interview with Madeleine Chapsal, which I want to quote from. This is also from 1966. Madeleine Chapsal, she's a journalist interviewing Foucault, says, "Now, as a philosopher, what most interested Sartre?" See, she's asking Foucault to tell what interested Sartre. So Foucault answers, "Sartre wanted to show that there was meaning everywhere. But that expression in his thought was very ambiguous. To say there is meaning was at the same time an observation and a prescription. There ought to be meaning. He said, we ought to give meaning to everything. Right? This is Sartre's big mistake, according to Foucault, to attribute meaning to things. So Chapsal asks, when did you stop believing in meaning? And Foucault says, the point of rupture, quoting Foucault, the point of rupture was the day when Lévi-Strauss for societies and Lacan for the unconscious showed us that meaning was no more than a surface effect, a mirroring, a foam, and that what deeply ran through us, what was there before we were, what sustained us in time and space was the system. Okay, now I'm not quoting Foucault, I'm going to comment a little bit. So what he's saying is that there aren't any humans, they're just systems. It was just an illusion to think that there were humans who had who gave meaning to their lives. What actually exists is systems. So Foucault's answer fits the pattern of the varied arguments I'm assembling in favor of the view that interpreting the meanings of everyday life leads to engagement with ethical issues concerning property rights, the commodification of human relationships that are classically posed in the works of Marx, but not just by Marx, by many others. So the phenomenology of daily life, as in Sartre or as in the linguistic hermeneutics of Charles Taylor, leads to radical criticism. But the French structuralism of the 1960s, or Pareto's theory of residues and derivatives, or any social science that avoids looking directly at the rules of everyday language games, does not lead to radical criticisms. It leads away from democracy, not mainly because the ideas of ordinary people are held to be illusions, but that is the case. I mean, Pareto's sociology sort of tells us that historical events are determined by factors that science can discover, but which ordinary human beings know nothing about. Ordinary human beings act according to a self-understanding that has nothing whatever to do with the cause and effects of social events and of historical events. So, and I'm contrasting Pareto with, for example, Sartre, who will say that we are condemned to be free. Being condemned to be free, we're necessarily responsible, and being responsible, we have a calling to solidarity with the oppressed. We need to be engagé. We need to be engaged in political activity, just because we are causes of what's happening, and our actions are determined by our choices. And Pareto said, no, nothing happens by human choice. Everything happens by factors which social scientists can discover that work quite independently of any kind of human consciousness. So, it's mainly what this sort of system type thinking that Foucault in 1966 is buying into, holds that the sort of conscious rule following of everyday life has no causal effect. It's not, as it is in critical realist social theory, the very source and constitution of social structure. It's not the script of the actors in the theater where social change must be performed. It's the opposite of Aristotle's uncaused cause. It's an effect that causes nothing. The uncausing effect, mere surface, mere mirroring, mere foam, as Foucault says. Now this line of thought, a line of thought which identifies progressives with the critical examination of the rules that govern the institutions that function in everyday life, and structuralism with conservative elitism, you might make an obvious objection. And the obvious objection is, well, what about Louis Althusser? Was he not supposed to be a Marxist? And was he not a French structuralist of the 1960s? Well, my answer to this is E.P. Thompson's answer. Althusser recycled, I know all my Althusserian friends are going to hate me for this, but nonetheless, it's what I actually believe. I really think E.P. Thompson is right, even though my Althusserian friends accuse him of being hopelessly superficial and not really understanding Althusser. Althusser recycled the latest trends of bourgeois ideology in a Marxist form. Quote Thompson, Althusser announces as original and rigorous Marxist theory notions that disintegrate the full historical process, notions highly regarded within bourgeois historiography. So when ideas like Althusser's define Marxism, then people like Cornelius Castoriadis leave the Marxist tradition because, I'm quoting Thompson, they see it as irreparable, inherently elitist, dominative, and anti-democratic. We have the scientists and we have the vulgar rest. I lived through this in Chile at the time of the Allende government. We all had seminars on Althusser, and we all learned about how it's the theoretical practice of the party that has to guide the revolution, and the masses are to be regarded as just incapable of understanding anything of true philosophy. For Foucault in 1966, on the other hand, with he said that Althusser within the Communist Party was doing the right thing. He was freeing Marxism from humanism. And so his efforts within the party and Foucault's efforts outside the party were both eliminating humanism. I'm going to quote Foucault here. Foucault's quote, "Our task today is to free ourselves definitively from humanism. And in that sense, our work is political." Later, a few years later, Foucault emerged as a critic of Althusser as well as of all Marxists, but we're talking 1966 right now. The Foucault of 1966 considered that the powers that be, both East and West, were defrauding the people under the cover of an empty rhetoric of human rights and an empty rhetoric of human dignity. I quote Foucault again. "Experience shows that in their development the sciences of man lead to man's disappearance rather than to his apotheosis." Close quote. Now Foucault has in mind especially his own interpretations of the scientific advances due to Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jacques Lacan, and Georges Dumézil. Now in his interview with Madeleine Chapsal, he also disclosed why he decided to cast what he wanted to say in terms of an episteme incompatible with Lum. Now what am I saying? I'm saying that in his book, the one we're talking about right now, The Order of Things, he organizes the thinking of different historical periods according to certain episteme. And the episteme of the classical age was, remember, representation, making tables to represent all sorts of things. Okay. And it's going to turn out that this kind of episteme, this representation episteme, is incompatible with an idea of humanity like Lum. Okay. So Foucault, the way Foucault answers Madeleine Chapsal in this interview illuminates the overall design and plan of the order of things. He tells her, and he tells us, that today, this is today meaning France in 1960, knowledge is reverting to the empire of the sign. In other words, we're reverting to representation. We're reverting to the episteme of the classical age. Quoting Foucault, Lum must disappear for the same reason he appeared. Lum could not appear in the 17th and 18th centuries because he was incompatible with the episteme of representation. He could only appear when Kant invented him at the end of the 18th century. He appeared when the episteme of representation ended, as that dual being, the subject at once empirical and transcendental. I know this is confusing, but so this dual being was required by modernity. And now he has to dissolve because Lévi-Strauss, Lacan, and Dumézil are dissolving the subject and into the system. Now I'm going to quote Foucault again, and I'm going to explain this over again. So if you don't understand it, just wait, I'll explain it over again. Quote Foucault, "In a certain fashion, we are returning to the point of view of the 17th century. With this difference, not putting man in the place of God, but rather an anonymous thought, a knowledge without a subject, a theory without identity." See, this is one of his answers to Madeleine Chapsal in the interview. So back in the 17th century, I'm going to try to explain it over in case you didn't understand it the first time. In the 17th century, scientists like Linnaeus were making tables classifying all the plants, for example. Or in the Port Royal Grammar, all of the forms of speech and logic were all being categorized and formed into tables and sort of tableau. That was sort of the episteme of science at that time, according to Foucault. Well, in that type of science, there's no place for the subject because things just are the way they are. And why are they the way they are? Well, because God made them that way. God made all the plants. Remember, this is before Darwin. Before Darwin, we're classifying plants. And these plants all have their certain essences. They are what they are. Why are they what they are? Well, God made them that way. So everything can be laid out, categorized by scientists, or what sort of, or natural philosophers they were called at that time, and it's all laid out as it really is, as part of God's plan. Okay. So later, Kant invented the human subject. Why is science the way it is? Why are the basic categories the way they are? It's because the human mind can't conceive them any other way. So the condition of any possible experience is to conform to the categories of the human mind. We live in three-dimensional space, according to Kant. We live in a time that goes from past to present to future, according to Kant, and we can't possibly have an experience that's not in time and space. So our mind imposes a basic order on reality, according to Kant. So now what happens in France in 1960? Kant goes out the window, system comes in, we go back to classifying everything in a system of representations, but this time there's no God. There's just a system, as Foucault says, a theory without identity. Okay, now what I want to suggest here is that it's not that Foucault interpreted his immediate intellectual environment. Remember, he's fighting Sartre, he's fighting all these people. At least he's not admitting who he's fighting, but he really is. Foucault didn't just interpret his immediate intellectual environment by a throwback to the 17th century. It was the other way around. What he did, and I think this comes out in the interview, when he wrote The Order of Things, he created an interpretation of the 17th century, which would then perform the function of showing why, if we're going back to that humanity disappears. He created a sort of predecessor of the contemporary idea of systems with no subjects, because in the 17th century there were classifications with no subjects. So, as he himself says, that the contemporary French debates on humanism created the point of historical possibility for his own archaeological research. Now, let me give some reasons for this view, that he sort of invented his view of the 17th century because of the function it would have in contemporary debates in France in the 1960s. Foucault knew perfectly well that for Renaissance humanists, man was a being made in the image of God. He knew perfectly well that for Shakespeare, man was an actor on the stage of life, that for Descartes, man was a chose qui pense, a thing that thinks. He knew people were talking about humanity all this time. So why does humanity suddenly exist when Kant invents him, when people were talking about humanity in lots of different ways in this historical period he's studying, but he doesn't mention them? Man gets invented by Kant at the end. So if during all these centuries men and women didn't really exist, because in spite of all the endless talk about humanity, well, it would be because the endless talk was not specifically about l'homme. It wasn't specifically about humanity as defined by Kant, taken to be the real definition of humanity by Foucault, taken to be the definition of something that doesn't exist, and therefore needs to be abandoned. So in all those tables, what Foucault found in the 17th century was a passion for conceiving everything in terms of tables, for classifying everything. But in those tables, there was no space to locate man as doing the classifying. They were just tables describing things as they are. Well, why not? Because God already classified everything when it was created. Things were simply there. Now Hume, good old David Hume, this may lose people who've never heard of David Hume, but for those who know something about Hume, Descartes says Hume was possible because God had been there ahead of him. In other words, what Hume is telling us is, I have certain sense impressions or certain impressions which lead to my ideas. And the way I do science is I classify all my ideas. Well, why can I have all these impressions, which I can then classify? Well, according to Foucault, it's only possible because God has already been there, and God has already laid out this world to be classified. Of course, Hume didn't believe in God, but according to Foucault, Hume could only have these classifications of sense impressions because of the previous tradition of thinking of science as classifying things. So Hume was possible because God had laid out a field of phenomena which only had to be perceived and then represented. But Hume was only possible for a while and to a certain extent. As this is, if you want to read more about this, it's in chapter 7 of The Order of Things. Now Hume himself was remarkable. I think one thing that makes Hume a remarkable figure is that he actually drew the logical conclusions of his worldview. And one of the logical conclusions was that he himself didn't exist. He himself was not necessary. He could find no perception of the self, and therefore he rightly concluded, in terms of the episteme he was working with, he had no good reason to believe in his own existence or in that of anything else, or no good reason to believe in any links between causes and effects. Now, Foucault says it was because Foucault says it was because Hume was working in this tradition of this classical episteme of representation that was not viable without God, that that Hume came to these logical conclusions, denying, among other things, his own existence and that of cause and effect. So, therefore, there had to be a Kant. I mean, Kant himself tells us that it was Hume who awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. So Kant comes along and he says, no, it's all the other way around. The nature must conform to mind. Mind must find causes and effects. So we have to see causes and effects everywhere because that's the way pure reason is organized, and that turns out to define humanity as well as everything else, humanity being a transcendental being who participates in this pure reason. So there had to be a Kant because someone had to find a way to do God's work, making sense of the world in the absence of God. And Kant found a way. He invented l'homme. This is Foucault's story. He invented humanity. But at a certain point, there had to be l'homme. L'homme was needed, but l'homme is not needed anymore. He was needed then, but he's not needed now. He's not needed now because today we have systems. I quote Foucault again. By system, one should understand a set of relations which maintain themselves, which transform themselves independently of the things they link. One has been able to demonstrate, I'm still quoting Foucault, for example, that the Roman myths, the Scandinavian myths, the Celtic myths, caused to appear gods and heroes quite different from one another, but the organization that linked them, their hierarchies, their rivalries, their betrayals, their contracts, their adventures, were a single system. So Foucault goes on to talk about codes in biology. He takes the coding of DNA to be a further proof that it's systems that science is really about. And then he talks about Lacan's psychoanalysis and about recent discoveries in prehistory. And I quote Foucault again, before any human existence, before any human thought, there was already a knowledge, a system which we rediscover. So from the premise of the non-existence of humanity, Foucault draws the conclusion that all projections for the liberation of humanity or for the emancipation of humanity are nonsense and frauds. Now, Foucault admits, even in The Order of Things itself, he admits, if you notice a few occasional remarks, he admits that his reading of the 17th century is unusual. It's more common to see in the 17th century not so much a passion for ordering things in tables as a passion for Galilean physics, for Cartesian analytic geometry, and finally for a Newtonian mechanical worldview, culminating in Kant granting to Newton's physics the status of a priori necessary principles of all time and all place. The more common ways of reading the period that Foucault discovers read that history in terms of physics dominating all kinds of thought, including the nascent economics. Well, what's Foucault's excuse for reading history differently from the way people usually read the intellectual history of that particular period? Well, his excuse is that he says this mathematical world, this thinking of the world with mathematics, is characteristic of the study of simple phenomena, like the orbits of the planets. An orbit of a planet will be one conic section or another. So all these Galileans and all these astronomers, yes, they were there, but they were studying simple stuff. Foucault's interested in complex stuff, like human life, like language, like exchange. And that's why he is justified in reading the history a different way, studying Linnaeus instead of Galileo as an example of what science was like at that time. Well, later, you ready for this one? 3 years later, 1969, he puts out another book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, which we'll talk about next time, in which he agrees with the critics. He says that it was really arbitrary on his part to think of representation as the episteme of the classical age. So look at that next time. But right now I want to give one more reason why humanity survives in spite of Foucault's low opinion of humanity. And here I'm referring not just to humanity as conceived in other ways by other cultures, but even of the specifically Kantian type of humanity that Foucault calls l'homme. Let's peer into the maternity ward of the late 18th century and look again at the birth of l'homme. Immanuel Kant, according to l'homme's birth certificate, is his father. Although he lived in the 18th century, really had very little truck with the century's Foucauldian episteme, with Linnaeus, Port Royal Grammar, and so on. Kant was a dyed-in-the-wool Newtonian when he wrote, every natural thing works according to laws, everything, and yet human beings, only in a vernunftige Wesen, a rational essence, a human, can work according to the conception of laws. What he had in mind, what Kant had in mind, was the capacity of the human being to follow moral and juridical rules, the capacity of the human being to follow moral and legal rules, conceived by Kant as analogous to physical laws. That's what Kant really had in mind. Okay, but now let's let the critical realist comment on this. Let the critical realist make the case that this rule-following creature that Kant described actually exists, but she exists not where Kant said she was, not in the realm of pure reason. She exists where Kant said she was not, namely in the world of empirical facts. Now this remarkable human capacity, this conception of law, the capacity to form groups whose members respect the rules of the group, does not depend on the transcendental premise that Kant affirms and Foucault denies. It's observed. The biologist turned psychologist, Jean Piaget, showed empirically that children growing up under normal circumstances develop patterns of behavior guided by norms of mutual respect, which are remarkably similar to the ideals that Kant had described in his philosophy a century earlier. So Piaget's findings have been amplified, modified within several different cultures by hundreds of researchers working in the fields of psychology and comparative psychology. So for this and other reasons, we can say that the human being is biologically programmed to be ethically programmed. Non-authoritarian moral authority, non-authoritarian moral authority is not an unrealizable utopian dream. And it's not a metaphysical postulate that requires you to believe in a transcendent pure reason. It's everyday life. L'homme, humanity survives because people, and indeed la femme, even more than l'homme, really are what the liberal thinkers at the beginning of the 19th century thought they were. They're social animals who can learn, and normally do learn, to respect moral and legal rules. So the rule of law as a principle of political authority is viable because of a biological proclivity.